Really happy to be here today, and I've brought some information in this realm of intelligent self-service in the space of chatbots and digital transformation. And I brought some information about sort of where the AI solutions are right now, and some information specific to healthcare and specific to life science companies around utilization of that technology and sort of how it has worked previously, and some similarities and differences that sort of helped inform this starting platform, this baseline intent recognition and understanding that we've developed. So if we sort of start this story at kind of general state of AI, just to give us a foundation here, we want to talk a little bit about self-service adoption, right? So we know that the world has changed a lot in the past year or so, and we know that for a lot of people, this ability to use artificial intelligence, to use automation, has become an accelerated thing that people are interested in at this particular point in time. But we also know that there is a pretty significant failure rate for projects of this nature, right? There's this real push and pull happening between people having a lot of interest in driving this kind of technological automation, but then there's a gap in terms of the ability to execute on that. So when we start talking about what does that look like within the healthcare space, it even expands that problem even more, right? And we understand that the conversations that you're trying to have with your user group, with your patient group, tend to be about complex things. They tend to be things in a pretty sensitive nature that come with a lot of regulatory challenges and a lot of complexity associated with solving those problems. So on top of sort of that overall challenge around implementing some of these things, I can imagine if I were in a life science company's shoes, this problem could seem even bigger based on how much data and how complex of a system your patients are operating under. So if we know that we are in a place where we have a complex problem, we have a lot of data that needs to be consumed and interacted with in order to make sure that we are having the right conversations with the right people in the right channel at the right time, can seem like an almost overwhelming problem to solve. But even as we begin to look at these dozens of channels and billions of interactions that you could potentially be having with the patient, one of the things that we have noticed as we've begun to have some of these automated conversations on behalf of life science companies, with patients, with providers, with clinicians' offices, there's a lot of similarity in what people are actually asking about. So what we are able to do is set up a platform. And these Verint IVAs, these Verint Intelligent Assistants, are conversational interfaces that can have almost any conversation that you might like to have with a patient, or really with any kind of user that makes sense for your business, about whatever kind of information that you either need to convey to that patient, receive from that patient, or have an interrogatory conversation that sort of combines those things. So example I've pulled up here is a little bit more in the insurance space, but it's a similar sort of concept, right? Regardless of the particular conversation that we want to have, our mechanism here is really to understand this user's intent contextually. So I understand who I'm talking to. And that way, when that patient asks me, does my plan cover routine eye exams, I have a personalized response for that. And we can answer in a way that is natural conversation based, not necessarily just a bunch of clicking through decision trees, right? So from an overlying perspective, whether we're talking about typing in inputs, speaking inputs, whether we're talking about a purely digital experience, kind of falling in that traditional chatbot space, or whether we start talking more in the voice experience, because we can have these same interactions over IVR channels, over voice bots, or really in any kind of system that allows for turn-based dialogue. We can implement these same brains and the same underlying understanding in those channels in order to have these conversations. So when we sort of combine all of that experience of the structure of these Verint IVAs that are allowing us to have these conversations, the problem statement of we've got to have a lot of problems understanding these needs of these various patients in various places at various points in time, we've sort of come to this overall structure and this overall starting point that allows us to utilize what we call relational cognition to support the amount of complexity that is necessary to solve for these highly disparate problems in many channels in a way where we have an out-of-the-box baseline understanding that can be customized for your drug, your disease state, your patient group. Maybe you're not interested in targeting the patients, but more along provider questions, or assisting with back office support of something like a prior authorization, right? That whole suite of experiences can be supported with the baseline relational cognition. I'm going to show you some examples of how we've utilized that for a couple of different life science companies here in kind of a blinded fashion. So we won't get into any specifics over who's using what, but we will see some real patient data and some real sort of representational information about where popularity of different use cases end up falling out. So start off a little bit around what specifically was underlying the information that we're going to see data from here. The primary piece of information here is all being processed through this healthcare natural language model. So our baseline natural language model operates at somewhere above 800 intents, and we'll get into a little bit more detail about how that drops out. Some of that has to do with whether or not you want to count the intent as me understanding, can I drink while taking a medication versus can I drink while taking any one of the medications that we have supported. So that's kind of where that plus number comes from. But the medication intents are also wrapped around by this adverse event product quality complaint system that we recognize is really important for having open dialogue with patients. So to ensure that you can meet your mandatory reporting needs, we have included within this language model pretty robust symptom detection, so that if a user does happen to incidentally drop any bit of information that lets us know that they have something that might be a reportable AE, the system has the necessary understanding out of the box that we just have to configure for your particular environment. What do we want to do with that information? We also have some baseline solutions for a lot of the things that tend to be impactful in medication adherence. That's where we're talking about symptom tracking, less from an adverse event perspective and more from a how do we help the patient with it perspective. And then also some information around delivering health assessments that say may be useful as a patient reported outcome, or may just be useful for the patient themselves. And some really interesting solutions around making sure that we can appropriately present fair balance where needed so that our claims are appropriately supported. So that's from a baseline perspective, sort of what is underlying the data that we're going to look at in these next couple of slides. So this one's an eye test, and we're going to see a couple of these, but I want to orient you a little bit so we can start to observe some of the patterns that we see as we begin to explore some of this information. So the data that we're looking at here, and you can see it's labeled all up top there, is a representative sample of approximately a month of interaction from several different real life in production IVAs that we have put in place for several different sort of medical use cases. So if we aggregate all this data and we roll it all up, you can see in this view where different terms fall out from a popularity perspective. So this one's kind of like a word cloud, but it gives us a little bit more information as we drill in and sort of look at the reporting of this around how people are using it. So if I look at just this medication bucket, so as I've said, this is blinded data. So this is representative of not one medication, but several different medications. A lot of the inputs that the users have given us over the course of this history include that named medication in it. That makes a lot of sense. We'll also see people, again, this is blinded, so that's just tracks out as disease. We get a lot of inputs where people are specifically referencing the disease that they are talking about. So it's really interesting from a behavior perspective is kind of how frequent the fact that the medication and disease state are mentioned as kind of core pieces of information. And over half, if we include some of these additional pieces like medication here and medicine here, of the inputs overall are referencing those things specifically. But you can also see some other interesting patterns as we work through here. Got some misspellings for some different medications. There was quite a bit of interest kind of just around COVID itself over the past year, which again makes sense. But from an overall perspective, the heaviest questions fall in this medication space. So if I actually pop out and we're just looking at within this realm of medication for overall user inputs in any of these implementations, what you will find is we start to get some really interesting questions around dosing. That's where that milligram comes in. We're also starting to surface some interesting things around drug access. That's where we start to see things around card, right? That is a card that is associated with a particular medication. And in most cases, those are things like copay cards. Also see a lot of questions that have to do with different methodologies of delivering this drug. So we see a lot of questions about injection, about syringes. So we also see a lot of overall questions that sort of operate in the way that this is going to impact some other body system. So things like, yeah, did we lose something, guys? No, okay. So things like the way that the alcohol, for example here, I didn't just pull that one up because it's the one that shows up in my brain most often, but there is also a lot of information that sort of falls into this concept of, is there a different dosage? Is there a generic coming out? We see a lot of those from overall patterns as big things that surface. But I think it's also worth mentioning as we begin to drill into some of this, we get down into some of these smaller boxes here. There's actually the tool that these screenshots come out of. We could explore down in infinite detail and get down to the specific conversations here. But we can spend a lot of effort, and there's a lot of organizations that are going to do really well at these high volume things. The nice thing about our relational cognition is it allows us to both understand a lot of these high volume intents, but then also get down here into these things that are slightly more specific. So if we continue looking down into kind of a next layer around medication here, we can see that a lot of these questions, again, there's a lot of clustering around this dosage space. This is where we start to see some more information about users asking if there is anything causally related for something that they might be experiencing with this specific medication. So overall, in terms of kind of the patterns that we see, that is what happens if we look at all of the data all together. We can start to segment this out into some smaller groups. So this is a particular client's data set. You can see for this client, there is a lot of interest kind of happening around this dosage. So the milligrams shows up because there's a lot of people asking questions in kind of that dosing space. You can also see that for this particular implementation, there's quite a bit of interest in the basically injection issues. So you see syringe there, you see some questions about kits and injections and solutions. So a lot of interest for this particular patient population and how they might go about receiving that injection. I don't know why that one's in there twice. This same back-end understanding, so that same structural conceptual logic is used for a different client, and you'll see that they actually have this data implemented in a slightly different way, and the data tracks with that. So instead of seeing lots of questions about injection, you still do see some, because this one also includes injected medication. But overall, this particular client gets a lot more questions around drug access and savings card than the previous client did, even though it's very similar use cases and being handled by the same underlying baseline conceptual recognition. This one I think is really interesting. So if we want to drill into questions that patients have when they use the word I. So how do users ask for things when they're referencing them in particular? So we see a lot of people telling us about password or email issues. See a lot of information around drug access here again. But it's also really interesting how many of these things kind of fall into some of these general, how do I improve myself? Like, how does my disease get better as well here? So this one is another client, and you can see theirs tracks out in something that looks a little bit closer to sort of what the overall reporting numbers are. And this particular thing, there's a lot of information around side effects. So this particular implementation has more clinician usage. And again, even though it's that same underlying set of concepts, that same underlying baseline, we're able to get some responses that operate in a slightly different space and give you a little bit more information targeted around functional dosing and side effects than some of the copay stuff that you see in that other option. Okay. This one, oops, the last guy I want to leave you with here that I think, wow, that is really annoying. Here we go. We're back in the right spot. This last piece I wanted to leave you with is another sort of I cluster. So what are patients telling me in this particular group? Most of these users are actually out here trying to figure out, how do I share my story? How do I become a good patient advocate, right? So we combine all of this information and all of this data that we have seen on several of these projects historically, and have developed this disease and medication-based intent library. So everything that you've seen in those previous slides is covered in some shape or form in this set of intents. So sort of our next step of configuration is plugging in the specific medications, specific disease states, and the specific misspellings of all of those things in order to ensure that we understand them all equally. But it's really this set of data and this starting place that allows us to be super confident that from the very beginning, your use cases, the conversations that you want to have with your patients, are going to end up falling in a really similar pattern. So the popularity, the way that those individual boxes end up falling out for your use cases will probably look a little different. It'll be somewhere between kind of the pattern we see in that big overall view or one of each of those individual views. But for the most part, the questions that we see consistently are very much targeted in this particular set of information. So give you a little bit more detail on a couple of those data sets that we were looking at and really sort of drill into what kinds of ROIs people have seen with these implementations. So this particular IVA was for a multiple sclerosis patient group, and this one was very much targeted towards medication adherence. And with this application within the IVA, we had a really, really high user acceptance rate. Users loved the app at a 90% rate, and 22% of the patient population on the specific medication during its most active time period was using the IVA. So if we are talking about medication adherence, if you provide a good experience for users, if you can really target the problems that they are trying to solve, you can see really high uptake and good results, provided that that patient needs are well met. And we're pretty confident, based on the historical data that we're looking at, we understand what those needs are likely to look like. And we've got some systems set up to be able to be responsive to those needs as they change. So you can see that adherence and compliance number over there. Those weren't our numbers. That is, in fact, the pharmaceutical company's numbers. So they are really, really impactful solutions that can be had in that medication adherence space. So this one is a little bit different set of use cases. So this one is not medication adherence. This is what's happening in kind of more of an unbranded portal. And within that solution, we've got a 32.5% engage rate, mint rate, which again is higher than industry average. But overall, our ability to be useful in that particular environment is that 84.5% intent recognition. So when I talk about sort of our ability to understand really well out of the box with that baseline that we have set up, that 84.5% is essentially that baseline configuration. So you don't have to put in a bunch of extra additional effort in order to be set up to have the conversations that you want to have right from the very beginning. When we talk about soft registrations during soft launch, that was one of the major driving factors for this particular implementation. And the fact that we were able to achieve those registration numbers without any additional advertisement on their part, it's all organic registration just based on the fact that the IBA was there and was able to be helpful, which I think also sort of speaks to the way that patient experience can be appropriately improved in a lot of these situations just by having an option there that's able to sort of sit and walk them through something that might be complicated in a way that they might have not understood previously. So a lot of the questions relative to that particular registration were people that weren't necessarily sure how to translate some of the medical questions that were being asked of them to sort of their lay person speak. And our ability to sort of facilitate that, I think, helped a lot with those registration numbers. We also see really, really, really high user feedback rates. And I think that that is a piece that can get lost really easily in terms of other values that having this kind of structured, unstructured data can offer your business. So not only do I have 30% of users providing us feedback about how they liked or didn't like the particular responses that that client has chosen to provide, I also can provide, in a similar way to the boxes that you saw earlier, some really interesting readouts in how people are using the system. So what are the questions that these users are actually asking when they're presented with a neutral interface that they can ask anything they want of? You can drive some really interesting patient insights into sort of how people are understanding what you've presented to them. Particular example in this space was they'd recently restructured their website, and it'd gone from having things be primarily sort of all focused under one umbrella to a case where some of the user needs were no longer met by this website, and instead they needed to go to a different location. They had an assertion that that was fairly obvious based on a bunch of outreach that they had done, but our data was able to prove that, hey, there are still patients that are really confused about where they should be going, and hey, it's easy enough for us to present that to them. So if we talk about sort of how we can approach this problem from an overall perspective, biggest thing that we want to make sure that everyone listens to and really is able to absorb here is that we've got some pharmacovigilance solutions in place. We've got a really functional baseline available to us here. We are set up from a medical, legal, and regulatory perspective to help you work through some of the pieces of this that may appear complicated. And the platform itself is really set up to be able to account for kind of all the complex hosting and security needs that you might need to help you get to these business outcomes that we've seen with other clients. And we hope that, you may have a use case that you'd be interested in talking about for the future. So all in all, that's basically kind of the data and experience that we were able to offer there. And we really would like to be able to, talk a little bit more about sort of how these foundations and how these really robust structural starting points might be of use to you. And I think we got to be getting pretty close to question time, right?
Yeah, well, we're out of our time here, but I do want to have one quick question, because all of this wonderful technology and all these wonderful examples that you've given us, is there anything you don't think that a virtual assistant should do?
We got to be really careful with how we answer questions. So I think it's always, I think virtual agents should be able to recognize a lot of information, but there are some things around how we might want to give patient advice, right? We might want to understand what this user said, and the right answer for them is something that falls in a diagnostic space. I don't believe that should ever be on a piece of AI. That should always be something where we are taking that information and we're structuring it in a way that a human can consume it very easily. But we still absolutely, anytime we're operating anywhere close to diagnosis, want to make sure that there is a human who has viewed that information and agrees with whatever recommendation we might make before it ever makes it back to the patient. So that ability to have that human in the loop, especially anywhere where it's about either changing of protocol or diagnosis, is absolutely critical.
Gotcha. Okay, thank you, Megan. If anybody in the audience does have any further questions or comments for Megan, feel free to chat her throughout the rest of the conference. I'm assuming you're going to be hanging out for the rest of the day, and appreciate that look into AI.